It's been 2 decades since William Cohen and George Mitchell worked at the U.S. Capitol representing the people of Maine. As they take a brisk walk across the Capitol grounds, the throngs of tourists are oblivious to the presence of a pair of distinguished public servants, two of the most important public figures from Maine of the last half-century, who hold fond memories of their time here.
I remember driving into work and see that dome. It just gave you a thrill to know that you were going into the House of Democracy.
Many a day we were out here right on those steps with greeting school children from Maine.
But their time on the Hill is only part of the story for these Mainers who rose from humble beginnings to become men of the nation, men of the world. Tonight they recall some of the highs and lows, the choices made along the way, as George Mitchell and William Cohen answered a call to serve. George Mitchell was born in Waterville in 1933. His father was the orphan son of Irish immigrants. His mother came to the United States from Lebanon as a teenager. After graduating from Bowdoin College and Georgetown Law School, Mitchell worked as a lawyer for the Justice Department. His first involvement in politics was with his mentor, Maine Senator Edmund Muskie. Mitchell was a staffer in the Senate office and during Muskie's campaigns for vice president and president. Mitchell won the Democratic nomination for governor in 1974, but lost to independent Jim Longley in the fall. Following that, he was named U.S. Attorney for Maine, and then Mitchell was appointed to the federal district court bench. He says he expected he would likely spend the rest of his working life as a judge. But when Muskie was named U.S. Secretary of State by President Jimmy Carter in 1980, George Mitchell was once again thrust into the political arena. He was chosen by Governor Joe Brennan to serve the remaining 2 years of Muskie's Senate term. Given the chance to prove to Mainers he was up to the job, he won a full term in 1982, and by 1988 was so popular he pulled 81% of the vote for re-election, the largest margin ever for a senator in Maine. Mitchell was also popular on Capitol Hill and was elected Senate Majority Leader, making him arguably the most powerful Democrat in the country.
Power changed hands in the Senate today as Democrats elected George Mitchell of Maine, a senator more liberal than many Democrats who voted for him.
In 1994, George Mitchell stunned the political world by deciding not to seek another term. President Clinton first offered Mitchell an appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court and then made him an envoy to Northern Ireland. Mitchell's legendary patience was put to the test as he led the talks that resulted in the historic Good Friday Agreement. Mitchell tried but was unable to duplicate that success when President Obama asked him to try to find a resolution to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Mitchell worked for a Washington law firm and sat on the boards of a number of major companies, and in 2006 helped Major League Baseball get its house in order by investigating the use of performance-enhancing drugs. William Cohen was born in Bangor in 1940. His father was a Russian Jewish immigrant, his mother of Irish Protestant ancestry. Bill Cohen helped out at his father's business, the Bangor Rye Bakery, and gained notice as an outstanding basketball player at Bangor High and Bowdoin College. After graduating from Boston University Law School, he became a partner in a Bangor law firm. Cohen's political ambition emerged early on when he was mayor of Bangor and a member of the school board at the same time. Bill Cohen was elected to Congress from the 2nd District in 1972 and seemed likely to toil in relative obscurity as a member of the normally quiet Judiciary Committee. But then came the Watergate hearings, investigating whether the Nixon administration had obstructed justice. Cohen was one of 17 Republicans on the committee, and only 7 of them voted for any articles of impeachment against President Richard Nixon. Cohen voted for 2 of them. His diligent work on the Watergate hearings and political courage in breaking with his party earned Cohen a place on Time magazine's list of America's future leaders. Cohen defeated incumbent Bill Hathaway for the U.S. Senate in 1978 and was re-elected twice. During his years representing Maine in Washington, Bill Cohen found time to write novels and books of poetry. Cohen retired from the Senate in 1997, but had to put his plans to re-enter the private sector on hold when President Clinton reached across party lines to appoint him Secretary of Defense.
Now the Senate's loss will be our administration's gain. I thank Senator Cohen for his willingness to cross party lines to make sure that America's security is there in the 21st century.
As Secretary, Cohen oversaw U.S. military action in Iraq and Kosovo and traveled the world in both a military and diplomatic role. When he left the Pentagon in 2001, Cohen founded an international consulting company called the Cohen Group. If you want to win an election in a state like Maine with a small population, retail campaigning is a must.
I ran for office by walking and walked all the way from New Hampshire to Canada. And it took me 7 weeks, 7 days a week, 22 miles a day, shaking every hand along the way and staying with people picked at random at night. And most people said they could accommodate me even if they didn't have a bed, they would have a couch or a chair. And it brought me into very close contact with people, and I listened to them and their hopes, their challenges, some of their anger, and it made me, I think, a better representative as a result of those walks. Two very important lessons when you're campaigning for office, in the way that I did at least. Number one, do not go into beauty shops when women are having their hair done. Big mistake on my part. Number two, don't go into bars. If people have been drinking and they see a politician coming in, shaking hands, it can present some real challenges. And I found that on one occasion I learned a lesson not to continue that particular practice.
George Mitchell had to perfect the art of retail campaigning too. He had lost the race for governor in 1974. Bowdoin College political scientist Chris Potholm says Mitchell succeeded in his first Senate campaign by learning from his mistakes.
When he ran for governor, it's a textbook case. He did every single thing wrong. He made every mistake you can make and lost. And he was a very quick learner, a very smart learner, and he must have spent hours in the middle of the night saying, if I ever get a chance, I'm never going to do that again.
I visited every single high school in Maine. I spoke at a graduation at every one. I visited, I think, almost every town. And you learn a lot about people. When I was first running, I was way behind in the polls and I needed to do something to distinguish myself. So among other things, I said that I would meet privately with any person from Maine who wanted to meet with me. At first there wasn't much demand, but I would go back on weekends and I'd sit in my office in Portland or Rockland or Presque Isle and meet with 10 minutes with any person who wanted to talk to me, and I had an aide there to make notes. It really was, to me, very eye-opening, reassuring.
Sandy Maisel, a professor of government at Colby College, says Mitchell had the right opponent.
When you compare George Mitchell and David Emory, both of whom are outstanding public servants in different ways, as who you want to stand up to represent Maine in the tradition of Margaret Chase Smith and in the tradition of Ed Muskie and in the tradition of Bill Hathaway, but by that time also of Bill Cohen, George Mitchell was more articulate. He said national leader when you looked at him. David Emory said, I'm the guy from the coast. I have the thick Maine accent. I know the people who I represent, but I'm not going to have much of an impact nationally. And I think that resounded pretty well with the voters in the state.
Bill Cohen had a long run in the House and Senate. But during the Watergate hearings, Cohen believed he might be a one-and-done congressman. Many Republicans were upset with Cohen's determination to follow the evidence, even if it damaged a Republican president.
They were. In fact, I had planned to serve only one term, given the anger and the hostility directed toward me at that time.
Then came the so-called smoking gun tape. President Nixon is heard ordering his staff to have the CIA tell the FBI to stop the investigation of the Watergate break-in. It was obstruction of justice from the Oval Office.
And then, of course, I think that made him bulletproof with a lot of Democrats and independents after that. I mean, even though it looks like now like it was going to come out that way anyway, at the time, it didn't look, it was a tremendous act of courage. And the hate mail he got, I mean, I read a lot of it, and I couldn't take it anymore after a while. I don't know how he did.
But I thought the evidence was pretty clear to me, and I knew that it was going to be difficult, and I had a pretty good challenger coming up, and Republicans were saying they would never support me again. So I really wasn't planning to come back until a tape surfaced, and then there was a delegation that went to the White House and said the president needed to resign. Then public sentiment shifted at that point, but up until that point, I didn't think I could win.
When we come back, George Mitchell and Bill Cohen forge a strong friendship as they tackle the unique challenges of representing a small state in Washington. When there are just 4 members of your congressional delegation, 2 senators and 2 representatives, one quickly learns that working together helps maximize Maine's clout.
When I first entered, I was the only Democrat in the Maine congressional delegation. Bill was in the Senate, and Jock McKernan and Olympia Snowe were in the House. But we had a really good relationship right from the start. We, all of us, personally got along, still do to this day.
George Mitchell and Bill Cohen wanted to avoid the rivalries sometimes seen in large states.
We wanted to say Maine's a small state. It's only 4 of us, 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate. We have to make sure we don't try to one-upsmanship each other.
Chris Potholm of Bowdoin College says the template was set more than 50 years ago with 2 very different senators, Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican, and Ed Muskie, a Democrat.
And I think that's relevant because Margaret and Ed set the tone that you've got to work together for the state of Maine, and they all followed that pattern.
Our relationship was pretty good from the outset, and once I got elected to a full term, we established what I think really was one of the best friendships I had in the Senate and beyond.
Actually, our friendship started to deteriorate once he was elected. Because then it became a question. I was the senior senator from Maine. He was the junior senator. So we had a little bit of rivalry going on in terms of who goes first in speaking and how long one can speak.
Although there are obviously rivalries, and it was a little bit awkward at the beginning because Congressman Emery and Congresswoman Snowe both announced that they were going to run against me. He ended up being my opponent. But even then, we got along.
Yeah, my impression was that it was actually quite close for people who could have been much more competitive than they were. The staffs, on the other hand, of course, were very, very competitive, and they always wondered why their bosses were quite so friendly.
Members of Maine's congressional delegation learned that people expect to get to know their representatives and see them in person.
On the 4th of July, for every year that I was in the Senate, Bill and I and Olympia used to join us, would have a schedule of parades that we marched in. After a while, I got tired of it. But when I left the Senate, I went to Northern Ireland, and for 5 consecutive years on the 4th of July, I was outside the United States, and the one thing I missed was those 4th of July parades. It's funny, when we were in them, it didn't seem so great, doing it year after year, parade after parade. But when I wasn't doing it, then I thought, gosh, I wish we were back there marching in those parades again.
Actually, we could plan our schedules a year or 2 in advance, knowing exactly where we're going to be. It would either be the lobster parade, it would be the egg parade.
The potato festival at
Fort Fairfield.
Yeah.
So we knew exactly where we were going to be at any given weekend in Maine during the summer months. And we all had to be there. Because if Senator Mitchell was there and well, he came, and why weren't you there? Yeah. So we made sure that we were all together, showing that we didn't forget our roots. It hadn't gone Washington, that we were dedicated to doing our jobs in Washington, but we were dedicated to making sure we didn't forget the people back home.
Muskie can do more for Maine in the U.S. Senate.
Despite serving in different parties, both men looked up to Democrat Ed Muskie as a mentor, Mitchell in particular. When he began as a staffer for Senator Muskie, they spent a lot of time together driving around the state. Mitchell recalls a late-night drive from Calais to Bangor after Muskie had finished up a trip with a lot of speech-making.
After about 20 minutes of driving, he said to me, what did you think of my speeches? And I felt an immediate tension because I wanted to tell him the truth, but I was a little bit afraid of him. He had quite a temper, and I'd seen it in action before, and I'd only been on his staff for a few weeks. But I decided he expected the truth, and I told him, I said, the speeches were great, except I think they were a little too long. There was a long silence. I drove down the airline thinking, oh boy, I'm going to get fired or something bad's going to happen. And he said to me, he said, you're a smart young man. He said, someday you'll be up there giving speeches yourself. And when you do, you'll find out that there's nothing in the world like the sound of your own voice. And thereafter, whenever I gave a speech, and I knew I was going on too long, but I couldn't figure out how to end it, I think of Senator Muskie in the airline road, and I'd bring it right to an end.
And he also said, if you can't improve upon silence, don't. Of course, he ignored that advice himself.
Bill Cohen also admired Ed Muskie.
Well, George mentioned that when he came, there were 3 Republicans, and he was the only Democrat. When I went to Congress, I was the only Republican. There were 3 Democrats. So it was a complete reversal. But Ed Muskie was a towering figure and a towering personality.
Now that's the way that you bring change in an ordered society.
He had a volatile temper, but he used it to his advantage. You could never quite tell whether he was really mad or just pretending to be mad, because he always tended to get his way, whether it was pretense or real. People usually accommodated Ed when he got mad. But he was a good mentor to me. In fact, we became friends. I had toyed with the notion of running against him. After the impeachment hearings, I had pretty wide visibility through the state. Popularity was up as a result. And the poll numbers tended to show that I could actually win.
Sandy Maisel at Colby College is not so sure Cohen could have beaten Ed Muskie.
Now, Senator Muskie at that point had been in the Senate since, 1958, so he'd been there 3 terms, and he was getting older and he was feistier. But I think it would have been very, very difficult to turn him out. He had a very strong organization. He had great loyalty. The state did not have as much population mobility then as it does now.
Cohen ultimately decided he wasn't ready for the move.
Then I came to the conclusion, even if I were to win, I was convinced in my own mind that it would not be good for the state. I felt that he would still be a better senator than I would as a freshman.
Cohen's soul-searching included time pondering the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
And so I read the book. It talked about ambition. It talked about people climbing to get to the top of the mountain, that life was really on the sides of the mountain, and that when you become so ambitious, life is always just one step ahead of you. Your ambition is always driving you one step further, and I came to the conclusion that my ambition was in danger of outrunning the situation, that Maine would not benefit from that. I could lose. I might win, but I could lose. In all probability, Ed Muskie would be able to gather substantial resources, not only from the state, but nationally, given the figure that he was. But I, in my heart of hearts, said I could not be a better senator than him, so I waited.
Bill Cohen didn't wait too long, just 2 more years before making his run for Senate, taking on Democratic Senator Bill Hathaway, who was finishing his first term after having defeated Margaret Chase Smith.
Life is action and passion, and we must share in that action and passion at the risk of being judged not to have lived.
Again, it was the right decision for me politically, and I grew over those couple of years that I waited, and it turned out okay for me.
In 1987, Bill Cohen and George Mitchell shared the national spotlight when both served on the Iran-Contra Committee. Iran-Contra was a constitutional crisis sparked when the Reagan administration illegally sold weapons to Iran. In exchange, Iran promised to use its influence to help gain the release of American hostages in Lebanon. And the profits from the arms sales were illegally diverted to Contra rebels in Nicaragua who were fighting the communist Sandinista government. Ed Muskie, the former Maine senator and U.S. Secretary of State, served on the Tower Commission, which investigated Iran-Contra. Congress formed a panel to hold hearings. Maine was the only state to have both of its senators appointed to the 26-member panel. During the televised hearings, many Americans were captivated by a charismatic Marine, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. He had served the White House as Deputy National Security Advisor.
Do you solemnly swear that in the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. I recall that because Colonel North had such a magnetism, had generated so much popularity by virtue of those hearings that we were inundated with mail, and most of it negative.
North made a case that the scheme, legal or otherwise, was the right, patriotic thing to do. In North's words, a neat idea.
The notion that you would have a sale of weapons to a country like Iran, contrary to our stated public policy, inflate the price of the weapons, and then use that to create what Oliver North called an off-the-shelf, stand-alone, self-sustaining, covert capability, was really contrary to the fundamentals of our Constitution.
Maine's junior senator had something to say to North about patriotism, God, and country.
Of all the qualities which the American people find compelling about you, none is more impressive than your obvious, deep devotion to this country. Please remember that others share that devotion, and recognize that it is possible for an American to disagree with you on aid to the Contras and still love God and still love this country just as much as you do. Although he's regularly asked to do so, God does not take sides in American politics. And in America, disagreement with the policies of the government is not evidence of lack of patriotism.
I thought the way that Senator Mitchell handled that was extraordinary. And I sent him a note as soon as he had concluded his questioning and said I had never been more proud of Senator Mitchell than I was that day. And I feel that way to this day, that he conducted himself as a former prosecutor, as a federal judge, and as a very distinguished United States Senator.
Bill Cohen had established himself as a thoughtful and influential member of the Senate. One issue in which he played a vital role was President Reagan's push to sell AWACS surveillance planes to Saudi Arabia. Many feared that could be dangerous for Israel, and Cohen initially opposed the sale. When he changed his position, reaction was swift, and from the Jewish community, largely angry. But Cohen had taken the long view when he became the deciding vote on the sale.
And that strategically turned out to be of enormous importance, because we couldn't have fought the Gulf War without all of those bases that were the subtext of selling the AWACS to him. And Bill was under enormous pressure on that. I think as much, if not more pressure, than when it came time for the Nixon vote.
Even before his impressive performance on the Iran-Contra Committee, George Mitchell was building up political chips. As chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, he helped Democrats gain 11 seats in 1986. His party was now in control of the Senate. His colleagues recognized the need for an articulate and effective national spokesman, and Mitchell was elected Senate Majority Leader in 1988. One of his first calls was to the newly elected president, lifelong summer resident of Kennebunkport, George H.W. Bush.
It is a welcome sign of your good judgment that you have chosen to live in Maine even though you didn't have the good fortune to be born there.
If he walked through the gate down here, I'd say, great, I'm seeing a friend. And that's the way politics ought to be.
Mitchell worked with the new president and his administration on some major legislation, including updating the Clean Air Act, something that was a non-starter for President Reagan.
When President Bush took office, he said on his own, within just a few months after taking office, that he favored clean air legislation.
Too many Americans continue to breathe dirty air, and political paralysis has plagued further progress against air pollution. We have to break this logjam.
Which immediately transformed the debate from will there be a clean air bill to what will be in the bill. We had a very long and difficult negotiation, which culminated in a bill that passed, a very strong bill that has since been widely praised, and it wouldn't have happened but for his actions. So we had a lot of cooperation in the first 2 years. The last 2 years, particularly over taxes and the budget, got to be very difficult.
George Bush had made a very simple pledge when running in 1988.
Read my lips.
Democrats in Congress, including the Senate Majority Leader, felt that getting the budget into shape would require more than cuts. It would take new revenues. A deal was reached with the Bush administration, and many were angry that President Bush had broken that no new taxes pledge. Bush later won a Profile in Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library for his decision to do what was best for putting the nation's fiscal house in order. But it also contributed to Bush losing his re-election bid in 1992.
Well, I've heard from others that he was upset at me, mutual friends and acquaintances, but I don't know because I haven't talked to him.
Coming up, Mitchell and Cohen become respected national leaders in the Senate. So why did neither run for president?
This has been a
With all of their success in winning elections and building national recognition, did either Bill Cohen or George Mitchell ever consider trying for the big prize, running for president? And Secretary Cohen, did you ever think about it?
Not really. As a result of my vote during the impeachment proceedings, the party leaders made it very clear that any ambitions that I had would be severely curtailed. And in a way, it was very liberating. Because I found that I didn't have to cater to anyone else's views, didn't have to tailor my own opinions, and it freed me from the ambition of running for that office. You have to be really ambitious, you have to be totally dedicated to it, and that path was pretty much closed off for me. And I think it was Jefferson who said, whenever a man casts a longing eye upon an office, a certain rottenness sets in his conduct. And it tends to be true. Over the years, you find yourself confronting people whose ambition alters their behavior. Not always true, but that tends to be the case. And I never had to face that. I knew that being a senator was as high as I was going to go, and frankly, that was fine with me.
I did. In 1991, leading up to the 92 election, I had several of my Democratic Senate colleagues and a couple of groups of, I guess you'd call them national fundraisers for the Democratic Party, who approached me and suggested the possibility of running. But I decided against it for a variety of reasons. The principal one being that I had just been elected Majority Leader. It was in my first term as Senate Majority Leader, and the job was so difficult, almost overwhelming, that I felt I couldn't both be a candidate for president and serve as Senate Majority Leader. And I decided against it. Also at the time, President Bush, the first President Bush, was very high in the polls. You'll recall after the first Iraq War, his popularity was sky high, and it looked like it would be very difficult to beat him.
Bowdoin College's Chris Potholm doesn't believe either Mitchell or Cohen would have done well running for president.
I don't think in their heart of hearts either one of them were partisan enough and anxious to please the base of their particular party. I think not running was a very good decision for both of them. I mean, if you look at Ed Muskie, I mean, that was a brutal exercise in learning.
George Bush was beaten in 1992 by Democrat Bill Clinton, who played a major role in the next phase of Mitchell and Cohen's careers. Clinton offered to appoint Mitchell to the U.S. Supreme Court, but Mitchell wanted to remain in the Senate to continue an ultimately unsuccessful effort by the Clinton administration for health care reform. In 1994, Mitchell made a stunning announcement. He would not seek another term in the Senate. But his plans to devote himself to the private sector were postponed when President Clinton tasked him with what seemed an impossible job: help bring peace in one of the world's longest-running conflicts in Northern Ireland. George Mitchell had his diplomatic skills put to the test overseeing the multi-party talks aimed at ending the conflict. Many Unionists were distrustful of this American who was the son of an Irish immigrant.
A lot of personal hostility when I first went there. But I was there 5 years. I chaired 3 separate sets of discussions. And over time, I was able to demonstrate to them that I could make decisions fairly and without any bias or prejudice. And after a while, we all became very friendly. When I first took over as chairman, it was a very difficult and tumultuous scene, and 2 of the political parties walked out in protest at my becoming chairman. It was in the middle of the night, and I called them up the next morning and persuaded them to come back. And some of them said to me, well, we'll come back, but we still are opposed to being chairman, so we refuse to call you chairman. I said, well, okay, what are you going to call me? And they said, Senator. I said, well, that's not so bad. I've been called a lot worse, and I've been called senator now in the past 15 years, so that was fine. Toward the end, we became quite friendly. And after I left, gosh, every time I get back to Northern Ireland, I see these guys, and we put our arms around each other and have pictures taken together. So it all worked out pretty well, although there was some hostility at the beginning.
Mitchell also had to win over the people of Northern Ireland. When we visited with him in Belfast in 1997, there was this unexpected encounter.
Pardon me for interrupting you. I wish you well. You're a very brave man, and I hope you keep at it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm glad you can walk the streets of Belfast.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I invariably was approached by people, and the overwhelming majority were friendly, positive. Many were skeptical. Particularly in the beginning, I had many people say to me, we appreciate what you're trying to do, but you're wasting your time. I remember one very elderly woman who looked like everybody's grandmother saying to me, we've been killing each other for centuries, and we're going to be killing each other long after you've left.
2 years after Mitchell left the Senate, Bill Cohen decided not to seek another term. Again, Bill Clinton seized an opportunity.
Oh, I think he was a very good secretary, and I think he was a needed secretary for President Clinton at that time, that he needed somebody who had appeal across the aisle, he needed somebody who had a certain amount of gravitas, he needed somebody who was smart and was political. And Secretary Cohen filled all of those slots pretty well.
Well, I told him, Bill, I said, you know, you're going to go down in history. You're the only Secretary of Defense that ever fought a war and never lost a soldier, right? I mean, in Bosnia, we didn't have a single fatality. So, no, I think it was a tremendous feather in his cap, and I think he did a marvelous job at what is an impossible task. I don't think Clinton was really plugged into international or defense affairs, and so I think Cohen did an awful lot in keeping the agenda items on the president's to the president's attention.
Well, I was prepared on the technical issues. On the, I had spent 18 years on the Armed Services Committee, and I was 10 on the Intelligence Committee of those 18, and I was aware of all of the issues, all of the systems, all of the ways in which the pieces kind of fit together. But it's one thing to be sitting in a Senate desk, behind a Senate desk, trying to formulate policy. But then I get over to the Pentagon, now it's a different world, and now you have to make really life and death decisions and recommendations to the Commander-in-Chief, and it's a heavy, heavy responsibility that certainly I never thought I would be there. But I felt pretty confident that I knew what to do, and I had great people working with me.
The Secretary of Defense is also a diplomat.
Was it ever an issue, for example, if you're meeting with Arab leaders, to be someone who is the son of a Jewish baker from Bangor? Was there ever an ethnic or religious issue that you felt, or did that somehow come into your thinking when you're dealing with them?
Well, it didn't. I think as Secretary of Defense, I had great deference paid by all of the countries that were dependent upon us. So whatever their personal views were, They never surfaced toward me in that sense. I was very proud. I wear a ring on my finger to this day. It was given to me by an Israeli back when I made a tour, my first tour of Israel, with my Hebrew name on it. And I know that if I go to an Arab country, the first thing they'll look at is that ring. But I say I'm proud of that ring. I'm proud of my heritage. And you'll just have to view me as the Secretary of Defense of the great country. We think the greatest country in the world. I never had anyone really look at that or me in a way that was adverse.
Still to come, Bill Cohen and George Mitchell recall some of the best and worst moments of their careers. Every career has its highs and lows. For Mitchell, the lowest days were when he was first appointed to the Senate. Politicians were lining up for the chance to challenge him, and Mitchell's re-election prospects seemed dim.
I remember the date, May 7th, 1981. The Bangor Daily News ran a big story which said that Dave Emery would beat me by 36 percentage points if the election were held that day. And quoting the pollster, the sub-headline said, "He has no chance to win," meaning me. That was followed immediately by Olympia Snow putting out a poll showing that she would defeat me by 33 percentage points. And then Ken Curtis, thinking he was going to run, and at that time, putting out a poll showing that he would defeat me in the Democratic primary by 22 percentage points. So I wasn't at the bottom of the barrel, I was under the barrel.
Mitchell recalls attending 2 fundraisers in 1 week with equally disappointing results.
I'd had a fundraiser at a small farm in Aroostook County and a fundraiser in Beverly Hills, California, and nobody would come to either one. And what am I going to do now?
Bill Cohen says one particularly low moment for him came when he was Secretary of Defense. He was in the audience as his son was giving a speech at his graduation from nursing school in May 1999.
As he was winding up, someone passed a note all the way down to me, and I looked down and it said, "We have just bombed the Chinese embassy. Return to Washington immediately," and felt my heart sink at that point. And I hesitated for about a minute. I knew he was coming to the conclusion of his speech, that if I got up at that moment, I would disrupt everything, and if I waited 1 minute, that he would finish, everybody would be applauding, and I could scoot out. I waited 1 minute, scooted out, come back to Washington.
Yet Cohen says his greatest moments also came at the Pentagon.
It was exhilarating. It's the most exhausting, demanding, exhilarating and gratifying job in the world. There's nothing to compare to it. Of all the years of public service, a total of 31 in my life, the 4 at the Pentagon were perhaps the most personally rewarding, because I was leading an institution which is the best military in the world. And it would have to do with protecting roughly 1 million people from being, quote, ethnically cleansed, and conducting the air campaign against Slobodan Milosevic, and to do so without losing a single pilot or combat warrior for us. Those were memorable things, but just the day-to-day experience of being at the Pentagon with the responsibilities, there were just so many moments. But I think being with the military, being on the ground with them, being on the aircraft carriers in the middle of the Indian Ocean and elsewhere, those were the highlights of my life. These kids out there, they're 18 and 19 and 20 and 21, and they were doing the most extraordinary things. And to be with them and to see them in action, and to see how educated, dedicated, selfless they were, it was inspiring. Every day that I went to the Pentagon, I had a chill go up my spine just to be around them. So it was a job that, it wasn't a job, it was really a privilege.
His work as Senate Majority Leader brought George Mitchell many accolades, and his efforts that led to the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland earned even more, including an honorary knighthood. But for Mitchell, the high point of his life in public service is the college scholarship program he established when he left the Senate, using leftover campaign funds as seed money.
I visited every high school in Maine, and in the course of those visits, I met thousands of Maine youngsters and saw in their eyes mirror images of myself at their age. I was 16 when I graduated from Waterville High School, insecure, uncertain, had no plan or prospect in life.
Mitchell remembered those that helped him along his path, and he wanted to make that possible for more Mainers.
We give out a scholarship each year to a graduate from every high school in Maine. We've provided nearly 2,500 students with about $12 million in direct financial assistance. And that really is directly traceable to my time in the Senate, to my experience in visiting every part of Maine and every high school and meeting thousands of these youngsters. And for me, that probably will have a more lasting impact than any legislation or political action I was ever engaged with.
When we return, being a U.S. Senator might not seem like a risky job, but there have been some dangerous encounters. Serving in Congress can sometimes be dangerous. Bill Cohen recalls leaving the Capitol one morning at around 3 a.m.
It was a time when there was a lot of hostility with Iran, and there were posters being put up in some parts of town saying, here's how you can kill a member of Congress. And a car had been parked here at 3 in the morning. It was a Pontiac Firebird with darkened windows. Suddenly, as I'm walking down carrying a couple of briefcase books, the car came toward me, lights flipped up, and started slowly approaching me, and the window came down halfway. And I looked in the window and I could see 4 people inside. And the driver looked at me, said, "Are you a senator?" And I said, "No, I'm just a staff member. The senators all go over that way." And the car peeled away, and I knew they weren't looking for autographs. And that was the inspiration for the novel I wrote called Murder in the Senate. Happened right here on that night.
Mitchell also had a close call, this one in 1983. He was doing an interview with a reporter from Maine.
And we were sitting on a bench just outside the Senate chamber, right in there. We did the interview, we left. About 6 hours later, a bomb went off that had been placed under that bench. Those were very tense times when you think about it. Security was not what it is now. People had much easier access to the Capitol. It's a trade-off, a balance. You have to be thinking about such things now to prevent terrorism.
There have been other changes since Cohen and Mitchell served here, and not for the better.
It's a dysfunctional system at this point. It's something that is an embarrassment to me as I travel around the world. When I go carry the American flag and say, look at us, we're the leader of the free world, and we believe in the freedom of the individual, entrepreneurship, capitalism, democracy, and other countries say, yeah, but you can't make a decision. I see people planting their ideological flags in cement, and they won't bend. And it's seen, compromise is a word you can't use any longer. Compromise has been poll tested. It's a symbol of weakness, of lack of principle. And the irony is people say, I'll never compromise my principles. I am, however, willing to look for common ground. You know, okay, if it's common ground as opposed to a compromise, that's fine with me, but there's been very little common ground that's been achieved in the past 6 years.
I do think that it's difficult for the political leaders because the American people want 2 things. Competition. We don't believe in a one-party state or only one point of view. We want competition. We also want cooperation. And where the balance is between strong competition and effective cooperation is very, very hard to define in any particular circumstance. There are a lot of factors. Money is a big factor. A destructive, corrupting factor that's affecting our whole political process.
That's not to say there's no room for partisanship.
The House and Senate have always been a place for partisanship. George Mitchell is one of the most partisan Democrats that I've ever known. And I say that with absolute respect because he is an articulate, highly gifted spokesman for the Democratic Party on issues of importance to the party. But he always conducted himself in a way, in working with Senator Dole, who is a partisan Republican, in a way that they had mutual respect for each other and knew that ultimately there have to be compromises made. And they had a very good working relationship. They had enormous respect for each other. He used to bedevil us. We'd say, he's saying the most outrageous things and they sound so entirely reasonable. And it used to make us mad.
Observers such as Colby College's Sandy Maisel believe this is more natural for senators from small states such as Maine.
I think it does make good Senate leaders because they are used to talking to everybody on both sides of the aisle. Senator Mitchell had an amazing ability, still does have an amazing ability as far as I'm concerned, to be highly partisan and still do it in a bipartisan way in which you can discuss with other people. That's what you have to do in the state of Maine. You can't make enemies in the state of Maine just because you are of different opinions. You have to be able to discuss. People expect you to be able to discuss the other view, to take it away and to go down and have, breakfast at the diner.
And Bowdoin's Chris Potholm says Cohen and Mitchell are part of a distinguished string of Maine politicians who don't do things that embarrass the people back home.
That's exactly right. They were self-contained. They were appropriate, that overused word, but they were appropriate in their personal lives. They were very careful what they did, and they were just good moral people. I mean, they weren't tempted by the things that so many other political figures are tempted by. And I do think they had a subculture where they were competitive with the image and the memory of the one that had come before them, and I think that helped solidify that. But they were competitive in that sense. They wanted to do as good a job as Margaret had done and Ed had done.
It's been 35 years since Bill Cohen and George Mitchell began working together in Washington. Though they have differences of opinion, each possesses a powerful intellect and the discipline and determination to make the most of that gift. And though they haven't served together in decades, they have remained close friends. So how often do you get together?
Rarely. Yeah. A few times a year at various events. I tell my story, and last time he got up and walked out. That was great.
And as this particular reunion comes to an end, some of that friendly rivalry surfaces.
Edit him down, will you?
What's that? Edit him down.
No, I have to rely on you for 50-50 times because I know I can't rely on him.
We'll do our best.
All right.
I'll put my years of experience to work on that.
You know very well.
Editing is critical.
Yeah. Well, you know very well that we're going to time it to make sure you.
Well, we did our best.
A real pleasure.
Together again.
Yeah.